When you click on the Render Scene button, or when you select Render from the Render menu, you get a window with the rendering parameters. There are two sets of parameters. There are the common parameters and the max default scanline A buffer parameters. Whew, that's a mouthful. At the bottom of the window we have the cancel button to cancel the render. We can close the render window. We can render. We can choose the view that we want to render. We can choose production or draft quality, and we can swap the parameters for production and draft. Let's start with the common parameters. The common parameters are broken up into different areas. There's the time output area, the output size area, the options, and the render output area. Let's start with the time output. We can render a single frame, or the current frame. We can render the active segment, and with the active segment we can render every nth frame, and if this is set to 1, it will render every frame. Otherwise, it'll render every second, third, fourth, and so on. You can also select a range, and you can change this range with the number sliders. So we can render from frame 8 to frame 69 if we so desire. And we can also create a frame list. This frame list will render frame 1, frame 3, and then frames 5 through 12. And you can continue this list, adding a comma, adding another frame, adding a comma, adding another range, and so on. The output area lets me change the size of the rendering. I can choose a custom output size, or I can choose one of the presets for 35mm film, Panavision, video, and so forth. Or you can click one of these preset buttons to select these sizes. You can adjust the aperture width. You can adjust the width individually in the height or width. You can change the aspect ratio, or you can lock the image aspect so that when you move one, the other moves. Or you can lock the pixel aspect so that the image aspect changes. Let's move on to the options. We can check on for video color check. We can render hidden objects, for example, helper objects. We can use super black as the background for video. We can force suit two-sided objects, render or not render atmospheric effects, or render to fields for video. For render output, we can render to a file, and we can select that file by clicking here and naming the file and the file type. We can use rendering devices to render to video machines. We can have a virtual frame buffer on or off, and we can render over a network. Now let's talk about the max default scanline A buffer parameters. Whew. These options here are specific to the default rendering engine in 3D Studio Max, but if you have a plug-in rendering engine that you can buy separately, you may see different settings here. Since I don't, we have the basic max settings. Checking mapping enables or disables mapping materials. Clicking on or off shadows disables or enables shadows and casting shadows in a scene. Disabling shadows will speed up a rendering in your scene. Auto reflect and refract and mirrors checks on or off refraction, reflection, and mirrors. This again will speed up your rendering. The auto reflect, refract, and mirrors setting turns on and off the ability for refraction, reflection, and mirrors. When this is off, your rendering is going to go faster. When it's on, you'll have refraction, reflection, and mirrors. The Force Wireframe checkbox forces all of the objects in a scene to be rendered to be rendered as wireframes, and you can change the wire thickness here. The anti-alias checkbox turns off or on anti-aliasing, and the filter maps enables or disables the filtering of bitmaps for smoothing or anti-aliasing. Without filtering, the bitmaps used in the scene, whether in the materials or as backgrounds, will have alias lines and edges. And you can change the pixel size for these parameters here. The motion blur settings let you render motion blurs. You can have it applied or not applied, depending on whether this checkbox is on or off. You can select the duration of the blur, the number of samples for the blur, and the duration of the subdivisions. You can have image motion blur on for single frame rendering. And you can turn up and down the duration frames, and you can apply to environment maps if you want to. When you turn on or up ray trace shadows, it increases the quality, but it also increases the rendering time. The number of rendering iterations for reflect and refract increases the quality, but also increases the rendering time. When you have your settings all set, you can click on the render button, and it will render your scene. And you'll see the progress as the rendering continues down the camera view in the rendering frame. Depending on what kind of quality you're looking for, you might want to change the rendering settings depending on the quality and also the stage of the project. In the beginning stages of a project, you don't really need high quality renderings. You just need to get a rough idea of where you are. For a final rendering, you want to increase the quality as much as time allows.